So we can loosely break down the kinds of questions that they ask you into these three types. There's ones that will give a theme like social alienation, and sometimes even give something to do with form to accompany it. Like they might say fragmentation, they might say imagery. It's rare that they give something really out there with form. It's often something quite open-ended. So imagery, fragmentation, structure, voice. These are probably the four things that you would expect to see in a question that has a little bit of form to it. And it is unlikely that they even specify urban imagery or sordid imagery or even anything that specific. Then there's the questions that are giving some critical interpretation of Eliot's poetry or are about the nature of a critical study of literature itself. And then there are the questions that give you an excerpt and sometimes a theme or a value, but often not, and that just ask you about the relevance of that excerpt to your understanding of the poetry as a whole. So an example of the theme / value plus form question is this one from a few HSCs ago, which was, how does Eliot use fragmentation to portray alienation in his poetry? So we've got that balance there between a little bit of form and a little bit of theme, meaning that both of those terms would need to be in those topic sentences. Here's an example of the critical interpretation style of question. So it gives some broad statement that is relevant to what a critical study is designed to do. Powerful poetry is driven by the way poets respond to particular aspects of their world. So it's painting with quite a broad brushstroke there, which means in the introduction we probably start with something that's reasonably broad and open-ended about poetry, unpacking that question, before applying it specifically to Eliot and the poems that we're interested in. Another one that's in this critical interpretation style that can be a little bit more specific to Eliot's poetry is this one here where it says, Eliot's poetry has been described as a disturbing portrait of uncertainty amidst the turmoil of modern life. The reason why this is different in nature to one that just says, how does Eliot portray alienation through fragmentation, is these critical interpretation questions give you a claim that you need to weigh up. You need to think about, is this actually true? And you often get those prompts then that say, to what extent does this perspective align with your understanding of Eliot's poetry? Now, these claims that might be in a question are contestable, but they're not especially challenging a lot of the time. It's rare that you end up getting a statement with which you would flat out disagree with. However, if you feel like you wanted to disagree with the claim in the question, it's important that you, in an introduction, acknowledge why someone would believe that to be true, and then set up an argument that argues for the exact opposite of the claim that's in the question. So when you're answering this kind of question, you can't say, Eliot's poetry has been described as a disturbing portrait of uncertainty amidst the turmoil of modern life. However, it is perhaps more pertinent to argue that his poetry is about a search for spiritual meaning. You can't do that because that's just ignoring the question. That's not really grappling with it at all. And so you're not going to get more than like a 12 if you just dismiss the claim in the question. But if you were to say, Eliot's poetry has been described as a disturbing portrait of uncertainty, blah, 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 but then add in some counterclaim that complements it, which says, however, despite its lingering emphasis on uncertainty, there are also glimmers of the hope to find certainty within the turmoil of modern life. And that's building on the question, providing some extra claim that doesn't necessarily go against the question, but adds to it with something fresh, but it is still very much within the purview of the question, because we can take a term like uncertainty and look at its opposite and find potentially a launch pad from that for your ideas. Now, this one was, I think, one that some students tended to struggle with because this is one where more of the personal emotive judgment comes into it. Eliot's poetry employs unique voices to privilege personal reflection over wider social commentary. That is its strength, that is its weakness. So this one actually required you to have an evaluative judgment, not just of the significance and strength of the work, but its possible weaknesses as well. Now, it gives you a bit of an understanding of what its weaknesses might be. And the purpose of this is to really get you to plot where your judgment lies. It's almost like there's this spectrum where on one end we understand the poetry as being unequivocally strong, and on the other end, we understand the poetry as being unequivocally weak, and we want to figure out where your argument kind of plots on that spectrum. Is it more towards the strength, more towards the weakness, or some balance between the two as the question is implying? And then there's these extract and theme-based questions. So you might get a quote from the poetry, could be quite short, could be quite long. Last year's HSC question was, I think, the entirety of the final vignette in the Hollow Men, and then it asked about how the extract reflects your understanding of Eliot's poetry as a whole. With these kinds of questions, what you need to do is often interpret what themes you need to discuss yourself, because it sometimes doesn't tell you what themes to discuss. So you've got to look at the quote, interpret what the main ideas in that quote are, and then you can start plotting how the quote reflects your understanding of Eliot's poetry as a whole. You then, in the introduction, need to set up a clear understanding of what the excerpt means, so you can apply it to your understanding of Eliot's poetry as a whole. And also, I would, in the topic sentences, be weaving in some of the language from the quote. So, for example, this one on screen here, about vision, street, understands, we could weave a couple of those words into topic sentences. So there's just this constant connection to language from the question. It should also have some nod in every body paragraph in the analysis. Now, your analysis doesn't get dominated by the excerpt that's provided, but given the question is asking, how does it reflect your understanding of Eliot's poetry as a whole, there should probably be some connection made with the analysis that you ideally wanted to write and the concerns that are in that quotation, linking the two together.